Hey guys, hopefully you did fantastic on your quiz. Today's notes are mostly on topic 22C, which says know the properties for specific parallelograms, including rectangles, rhombuses, and squares. So we need to know rules about their sides, angles, and diagonals, but now we're not just going to do it for generic parallelograms, we're going to be able to do that for rhombuses, squares, and rectangles too. So let's start by just remembering what a parallelogram is. A parallelogram, by definition, its opposite sides are parallel. That's what it means to be a parallelogram. And we learned some properties about it last night. For instance, in terms of its sides, we know that its opposite sides are congruent. I know my squiggly looks kind of like an N, sorry. In terms of its angles, we know that angles are congruent. And we also know that consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, so we have that opposite angles are congruent and consecutive angles are supplementary. In terms of diagonals, we know that diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so that's what we learned about parallelograms last time. Those are our big rules for all parallelograms, which means rhombuses, squares, and rectangles sides are also, opposite sides are congruent. These three shapes, opposite angles are congruent and their consecutive angles are supplementary. And for all three of these, their diagonals bisect each other because these are subsets of parallelograms. They're just more specific. So we know that a rhombus is a parallelogram whose sides are all congruent. So rather than just opposite sides being congruent, all sides are now congruent. Okay? So if I were to draw a picture, it would look something like this. It normally looks kind of diamond-ish, but you'll notice all four of those sides are congruent. And there's a couple new properties. The first is that for a rhombus, its diagonals are perpendicular. So if I were to draw a new rhombus really fast, there's my diagonals. My diagonals are now perpendicular. Okay? Since it's a rhombus, all four of its sides are the same. Okay, my second new property is that diagonals bisect opposite angles. So if I were to draw a new picture, bigger this time. Ooh, that is not a pretty looking rhombus. I am so sorry, guys. So here are my diagonals. Okay. Since this is a rhombus, the diagonals bisect opposite angles. So this angle is getting cut in half. So these two halves are going to be exactly the same. And because these two big angles are the same, these two halves will also be the same as those halves. Similarly, this angle is going to get cut in half, and those halves will be the same size as those halves. So those are my two new rules for a rhombus. I also have a rectangle. And by definition, a rectangle is a parallelogram whose angles are all congruent. Specifically, they're going to be all 90 degrees. Okay. So if an angles are all congruent, here's an example of a rectangle. Those four angles would be congruent. Okay, rectangles have one new property. And it's that its diagonals are congruent. If I were to draw a rectangle, sorry guys, not my best drawing day. If this is A, B, C, D, we could say that diagonal BD is congruent to diagonal AC. And because we already knew that the diagonals bisect each other, we can actually say that all four of these pieces are going to be exactly the same. Okay, we've got one more parallelogram to talk about, the square. And its definition is that it's a parallelogram, and I'm going to shorthand this. A parallelogram, I use parallel lines and then gram. So a parallelogram whose angles are all congruent and whose sides are all congruent. Okay. So if I were to draw a picture of a square, my angles are all congruent, specifically 90 degrees, and the sides are all congruent. So if I can recap, we have parallelograms, and what I really should have said is a quadrilateral whose opposite sides are parallel. So we talked about parallelograms. All parallelograms' opposite sides are congruent. All parallelograms' opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary. All parallelograms' diagonals bisect each other. But when we get more specific, for instance, when we have a rhombus whose sides are all the same, now a rhombus's diagonals are perpendicular and diagonals bisect opposite angles. When we get to a rectangle, on top of all these properties here, their diagonals are also congruent. A square has the most properties. So for a square, all of these properties are true. All of these properties are true, and all of these properties are true. So as you move inwards, all the previous properties will be true. So make sure you've copied this down in your notes. Actually, this is going to be our topic 22. I think it's actually C and F. So topic C is about the specific properties. F is being able to organize this information into a graphic organizer. So this is topic 22C and F. Okay, so if you need to repeat this and watch it again, you can. But when you're done, you're going to move on to the topic 22 specific parallelograms worksheet.